Okay, let's dive right into this. We hear about US government debt all the time, and the numbers are just astronomical. But the most important question isn't just how big the debt is. The real question, the one that changes everything, is this: who does America actually owe all that money to? Because the answer to that question has changed big time. $38.4 trillion. I mean, it's a number so huge it's almost impossible to wrap your head around. If you stacked it up in $100 bills, the pile would literally reach past the moon. But you know what? The size of the number isn't even the most important part of the story. The real story, the one we need to understand, is who's holding all those IOUs. For decades, the answer to that question was pretty simple, right? It was other big governments, like China and Japan, and of course our own central bank, the Federal Reserve. But that whole era, it's over. Those traditional super stable buyers are stepping away, and a new and much more surprising group of creditors has taken their place. Now first, a quick but super important distinction. We often hear that big, gross debt number. But the number that financial markets really care about is this one: debt held by the public. It's about $30.8 trillion. This is the stuff that gets bought and sold every day around the world, and it's basically the bedrock of the entire global financial system. So to understand what's happening, you have to get this one crucial point. Not all buyers are created equal. You basically have two types. On one hand, you have price-insensitive buyers. Think central banks. They buy for big, strategic policy reasons. They're not really worried about the day-to-day price. Then you've got price-sensitive buyers. Hedge funds, regular investors. They are only in it for the profit. And the entire system is being turned on its head because that first group is leaving, and the second group is taking over. So let's start by looking at who's actually walking away from the table. The traditional pillars of the Treasury market, the ones who have propped it up for decades, are quietly heading for the exits. For years, the Federal Reserve was the undisputed heavyweight champion of bond buying, holding over $6 trillion worth at its peak. But now they're doing the exact opposite. It's a policy called quantitative tightening. In simple terms, as their old bonds mature, they just aren't buying new ones to replace them. The biggest buyer in the history of this market is now officially on the sidelines. And what about all those foreign countries? Well, these days, geopolitics is completely trumping economics. Think about it. When the West froze Russia's central bank reserves, China was watching very closely. And they realized, whoa, wait a second. U.S. debt isn't just a safe asset, it's a conditional asset. It's only safe as long as you're on good terms with Washington. So their holdings have plunged by over $500 billion from their peak. And the result of all this is just stark. A little over a decade ago, foreign buyers owned half of all marketable U.S. debt. Today, that number has collapsed to just 29%. This creates an absolutely enormous funding gap that someone else has to fill. So if the old guard is leaving town, who is stepping in to buy all this debt? This is where the story gets really fascinating, and it points to a totally new kind of creditor for America. Okay, the first new buyer might actually surprise you. It's people like you and me, regular American households and the mutual funds we invest in. With interest rates finally looking pretty attractive, people are jumping in and buying Treasury bonds directly. But, and this is a big but, this is opportunistic money. It's hot capital. If a better investment comes along tomorrow, this money can and will move out just as fast as it came in. And that brings us to the most surprising and, frankly, the most concerning new creditor of the United States government. The Cayman Islands. Yes, you heard that right. This tiny nation of about 70,000 people now holds $427 billion in U.S. debt. That's more than Germany, more than Canada. Of course, it's not the actual residents buying the bonds. It's the thousands upon thousands of hedge funds that are based there for, let's call it, tax efficiency. And how are they doing it? With a high-wire strategy called the basis trade. It uses insane amounts of leverage. We're talking 50 to 1 sometimes, to make tiny profits on tiny pricing differences. In 2024 alone, these leveraged funds absorbed over a third of all the long-term debt the U.S. issued. So let's just pause and put this all together. What we're witnessing is the great creditor rotation. We've replaced patient strategic capital that was motivated by long-term policy with hot, opportunistic capital that is motivated by one thing and one thing only: pure profit. This isn't just a small shift, it's a fundamental rewrite of who funds America. So what's the big deal? Who cares who owns the debt as long as it gets bought, right? Well, That brings us to the consequence of this massive shift. This new ownership structure has introduced a profound and, frankly, dangerous new fragility right into the heart of the global financial system. It all comes down to something called the marginal buyer problem. See, in any auction, the marginal buyer is the one who buys that very last item for sale, and in doing so, they set the price for everyone. For decades, that crucial role was played by a central bank that didn't really care about the price. Today, it's a hedge fund that cares about nothing but the price, and one that will vanish at the first hint of trouble. And this creates an incredibly dangerous feedback loop. When a real crisis hits, these leverage players don't step in to provide stability. They're the first ones out the door. They're forced to sell to cover their bets. The very buyers the market now depends on are guaranteed to run for the exits. And this isn't some theory. We saw this exact scenario play out in March of 2020, when the Treasury market, the safest market on Earth, completely seized up. And the risk today? Well, get this. Hedge fund exposure to this one trade now exceeds $1.85 trillion. That is significantly larger than it was right before the 2020 crisis. The kindling for the next fire has already been stacked, and there's even more of it this time. So what does all this complex market plumbing mean for you and your finances? All this talk about hedge funds and basis trades might seem abstract, but the implications are actually very direct and very profound. So let's boil it all down. What are the key takeaways from all this? There are three big ones. First, the so-called risk-free rate. Well, it isn't really risk-free anymore. It now has this hidden, fragile market structure baked right into it. Second, to keep these new profit-hungry buyers interested, interest rates will likely have to stay higher for longer. And third, if this market freezes up again, the Fed will be forced to step in with massive bailouts, no matter what's happening with inflation. Their hands will be tied. This all leads to a final and pretty provocative thought. The great risk to the U.S. isn't some sudden dramatic default. The real danger is a kind of slow-motion crisis, where the market just demands higher and higher and higher interest rates to absorb all this debt, until something in the financial system simply breaks under the strain. The question is no longer if, but when.